The air in the onyx room was so heavy I could taste it thick with expensive cologne, stale wine, and the unmistakable scent of a trap. I walked in expecting brunch, mimosas, maybe a conversation about the funeral arrangements we still needed to finalize. Instead, I found a firing squad. 5 people were already seated around the black marble table, staring at me like I was the defendant in a trial I didn't know I was attending. My mother, Cynthia, sat at the head, flanked by my stepfather, Douglas, and my 2 step-siblings, Tyler and Ashley. And at the far end, a man I had never seen before, a lawyer with a suit that cost more than my car and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Before I could even pull out a chair, my mother slid a thick document across the polished surface. The title was bold and offensive: Family Redistribution Agreement. She didn't offer a menu. She didn't ask how I was doing. She just pointed a manicured finger at the signature line. "Sign it," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a scream. "Sign it, or you don't leave this room." Before I tell you what they said when I started counting heads, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I pulled out the heavy oak chair opposite my mother and sat down, the movement slow and deliberate. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't reach for the water. I just folded my hands in my lap and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for them, not me. I'm Emily, 28 years old, and in my line of work as a cybersecurity analyst, I hunt people who hide in the digital shadows. I know how to spot a bluff in a line of code, and I definitely know how to spot one on my mother's face. As I looked at Cynthia, perfectly coiffed and radiating that manufactured grief she saved for public spectacles, my mind drifted back to the man whose money she was trying to steal. My father, Richard, was the opposite of this room. He was worn flannel shirts and oil stains on the driveway. He drove the same Honda for 15 years, not because he was cheap, but because he wanted to make sure my college fund was full. I remembered the nights he'd sit at our scratched kitchen table, teaching me how to balance a checkbook, his voice quiet and steady. "Integrity, Em," he used to say. "It's the only currency that doesn't depreciate." He gave me everything he had, not because he expected a return on investment, but because that's what a parent does. Cynthia cleared her throat, shattering the memory. She didn't look at me with affection. She looked at me like I was a ledger that hadn't balanced in 20 years. "We need to discuss the reality of the situation," she began, her tone shifting from grieving widow to debt collector. "Your father's will. It was sentimental. It didn't account for the actual costs incurred over a lifetime." She opened a folder I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was a list. An itemized, terrifyingly specific list. "I sat down with Douglas and we crunched the numbers," she said, tapping a manicured nail on the paper. "Do you have any idea how expensive you were, Emily? Orthodontics. 7 years of piano lessons you begged for, and then quit. Summer camps. The prom dress you wore once. The food in the pantry. The electricity." She looked up, her eyes hard. "We calculated it. The cost of raising you, providing you with a lifestyle that allowed you to become successful, it comes out to a significant portion of what Richard left. This inheritance isn't a gift, Emily. It's a reimbursement. It's back pay for the 18 years I spent sacrificing my own life to ensure you survived yours." The air left the room. This was the debt of existence, the toxic belief that a child owes their parent for the bare minimum of survival. She was invoicing me for my own life. Douglas, my stepfather, leaned forward, the smell of stale scotch wafting across the table. "It's not just the money," he grunted, his face flushed. "Think about the stress. I married your mother when you were 10. I gave up my prime years dealing with a teenager who wasn't even mine. We deserve this. That 1.2 million? That's our severance package for putting up with you. 10 years ago, that speech would have crushed me. It would have made me cry, beg for forgiveness, and sign anything just to prove I was worth loving. But I wasn't that little girl anymore." I looked at the invoice, then at the family redistribution agreement, and finally at my mother. She thought she was breaking me down, listing my price tag, like I was a used car she regretted buying. She didn't realize that by putting a price on our relationship, she had just freed me from it completely. If I was just a transaction to them, then I could treat them like a bad investment. And I was about to close the account. Tyler didn't wait for Douglas to finish his speech about sacrifice before he jumped in, eager to get his own kicks in while I was down. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his mimosa like he was bored, but his eyes were sharp. "Honestly, Em, you don't even need the money," he said, his voice dripping with that casual cruelty he'd perfected in high school. "You have a good job. You have that fancy degree Dad paid for, sorry, Douglas paid for, technically, since he was covering the mortgage while Richard played with computers." Ashley nodded, chiming in like she was reciting a script. "It's just greedy. she said, looking at her mother for approval. We're trying to build a future here. Mom wants to retire. Douglas has health issues. And you're sitting on a fortune just because your name is on a piece of paper? It's heartless. Dad would be ashamed of you. They kept talking, their voices overlapping, building a wall of noise designed to suffocate me. Greedy. Selfish. Ungrateful. Cold. They were throwing every weapon they had, trying to find the one that would crack the armor. They expected me to cry. They expected me to scream that I missed my father. To beg them to understand that the money was all I had left of him. But they didn't know I was listening to a different frequency. I wasn't looking at their faces. I was looking at the small red dot on the screen of my phone, which was resting face down on my thigh under the table. I could feel the heat of the device through the fabric of my dress. It was recording every word, every threat, every admission of coercion. Let them talk, my dad used to say when I came home crying about bullies. Silence makes people nervous, Em. And nervous people make mistakes. I focused on my breathing, keeping my face completely blank. I imagined my emotions were files on a hard drive, and I was dragging them, one by one, into the trash bin. Anger? Delete. Fear? Delete. Guilt? Empty trash. Cynthia mistook my silence for submission. She smiled. A tight, triumphant expression that didn't reach her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken me down to the point where I couldn't speak. The lawyer has the pen, she said softly, nodding toward the man at the end of the table. Just sign it, Emily. Then we can order food and go back to being a family. We can put this ugly business behind us. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at the lawyer, who had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable as he witnessed a shaking down in broad daylight. Then I looked at Douglas, sweating through his shirt, and Tyler and Ashley, smug in their victory. I finally moved. I didn't pick up the pen. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with a deliberate clink against the marble. You're right, I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely devoid of the tears they wanted. This is a lot of pressure. It doesn't have to be. Cynthia cooed. No, I said. I mean, it's a lot of pressure for just me. I looked around the table, pointing a finger at each of them, moving slowly, deliberately. 1, I said, pointing to Cynthia. 2, to Douglas. 3, to Tyler. 4, to Ashley. I turned to the lawyer. 5. The room went dead silent. The air conditioning hummed. A waiter dropped a fork somewhere in the distance. What are you doing? Tyler asked, his brow furrowing. Can you not count? I can count just fine, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. 5 people. 5 against 1. You brought an entire team to ambush me. You brought a lawyer. You brought a list of debts I apparently owe for being born. Cynthia's smile faltered. We're just having a conversation, Emily. No, I said. You're conducting a raid. I picked up my phone from my lap and placed it on the table. Screen up. I tapped the screen once. Funny thing is, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. I only brought one person too. I looked down at my phone and hit send on a single, pre-typed text. Now. The heavy oak door to the private room didn't just open. It was unsealed. Walter stepped through, bringing the temperature in the room down 10 degrees just by existing. He wasn't wearing the flashy, overpriced suit of a lawyer trying to impress a jury. He was wearing the practical, tailored gray of a man who buries people under paperwork for a living. Walter wasn't just an attorney. He was a forensic auditor who specialized in piercing corporate veils and finding money people didn't want found. Cynthia stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. Who is this? This is a private family meeting. Walter didn't even look at her. He walked straight to the table, ignored the empty chair, and placed a thick black binder onto the marble surface. The thud it made was heavy, final. It sounded like a gavel. My name is Walter, he said, his voice calm and bored. I represent Emily. And frankly, Mrs. Peterson. After reviewing the financials, I don't think you're in a position to demand privacy. Douglas's face went from flush to a sickly shade of gray. He knew that tone. It was the tone of a man who had seen the receipts. You can't be here. Douglas sputtered, standing up to try and match Walter's height. We're discussing a personal matter. Get out. Walter opened the binder. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply turned a page and pointed to a highlighted figure. We're not here to discuss the will, Douglas, Walter said. We're here to discuss the 3 shell companies you registered in Nevada last year, and the bankruptcy protection you filed for 3 months ago. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the silence of intimidation. It was the silence of a bomb having just gone off, with everyone waiting for the shockwave. Tyler and Ashley looked at their father, confusion warring with fear. Cynthia looked like she had been slapped. Bankruptcy? She whispered. Douglas told me the business was expanding. Douglas lied, I said. It was the first time I'd spoken since Walter entered. He's not expanding, Mom. He's drowning. And he needs my inheritance to bail him out before the creditors find the assets he's trying to hide. Walter turned a page. Hiding assets during a bankruptcy proceeding is a federal crime, Mr. Peterson. But attempting to extort a family member to cover those debts? That moves us into wire fraud and conspiracy territory. Douglas lunged. It was a clumsy, desperate motion, his hand shooting out to grab the binder. Walter didn't flinch. He simply placed a heavy hand on the document, pinning it to the table. He looked at Douglas with the pity one might show a rabid dog right before putting it down. I wouldn't, Walter said softly. Everything in here has already been sent to the trustee overseeing your case. This is just the courtesy copy. Douglas sank back into his chair, deflating like a punctured tire. The bully who had spent the last hour listing my debts was gone. In his place was a terrified man realizing he had gambled his freedom on my submission. And he had lost. I looked at Tyler and Ashley. The smugness was wiped clean from their faces. They weren't looking at me with contempt anymore. They were looking at the door, calculating the distance, wondering if guilt by association was a real legal concept. This is what happens, I said, my voice steady. You thought you were ambushing a daughter who didn't know how to fight back. You forgot that I spend my life analyzing threats. I didn't come here to negotiate, Mom. I came here to audit you. Walter closed the binder. We're leaving now. If you contact Emily again by phone, email, or carrier pigeon, I will personally walk the unredacted version of this file to the district attorney. I stood up. My legs felt strong. The air in the room didn't taste heavy anymore. It tasted clean. I turned to leave, ready to walk out into the sunlight, and never look back. I thought it was over. I really did. I thought facts and fear would be enough to stop them. But I underestimated the desperation of a narcissist losing control. I turned my back on them, my hand reaching for the brass handle of the private room's heavy oak door. Walter was right beside me, his binder tucked under his arm like a weapon he didn't need to fire again. For a split second, I let myself feel the relief. I let myself believe that the logic of the law and the threat of prison were enough to silence people who had spent their lives feeding on others. I was wrong. The crash of a chair was my only warning. Before I could reach the door, Cynthia slammed into it from the inside, arms spread wide, breathing hard. Her hair had come loose, sweat shining on her forehead. She didn't look like my mother anymore, she looked like a cornered animal. In psychology, this is called an extinction burst. When a manipulator realizes their control no longer works, they escalate louder, faster, more desperate, burning everything just to prove they still can. You think you can just leave? She screamed. Bring a stranger in here and threaten my family? Walter stepped forward calmly. Mrs. Peterson, this is false imprisonment. Move. She laughed, brittle and unhinged. I didn't need your signature today. I've had it for 6 years. She shoved her phone at me. A bank receipt. You remember your surgery, she hissed. You signed a power of attorney. I used it this morning. $1.2 million. Offshore. Gone. The room went silent. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd broken me. I wasn't staring at the floor. I was checking the time. 11:32 a.m. I'm not checking my balance, I said, smiling. I'm checking the timestamp. I slid my phone across the table. Critical fraud alert. Wire transfer blocked. Her face drained of color. At 8 a.m., I said quietly. We flagged that power of attorney as compromised. Not cancelled. Flagged. You didn't just fail. You committed wire fraud under active federal monitoring. Douglas collapsed into his chair. He understood. Sirens wailed outside. When the officers entered, Cynthia tried to play the respectable mother. It didn't work. The handcuffs clicked shut. I gave you life, she screamed as they dragged her away. And today, I said, watching. I took mine back. Months later, I stand on the balcony of my own house, the ocean air clean and quiet. Cynthia took a plea deal. Douglas went to prison. The rest disappeared. I deleted her contact from my phone. Shared DNA is not a life sentence. If you've ever had to walk away to survive, you're not alone.